They said she arrived in silence. No grand entrance, no entourage, just the faint, deliberate tap of heels on marble and the soft, unfamiliar scent of rosewater drifting across the Langston's lobby. People stopped without knowing why. Her movements were measured, graceful, but they carried an unspoken weight, the kind that draws attention without seeking it. The afternoon sun streamed through the hotel's towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor where guests in designer clothes moved with practiced indifference. But this woman was different. The woman's clothing was expensive but understated. A charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, Italian leather shoes that whispered against the marble, a silk scarf draped with mathematical precision. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing sharp cheekbones and the unmistakable gleam of a jade pendant at her throat. Margaret Wells, the front desk supervisor who had worked at the Langston for 15 years, noticed her first. She paused mid-conversation with a guest, her trained smile faltering as her eyes followed the woman's approach. There was something about her posture, the way she held her chin slightly raised, her hands clasped behind her back, that spoke of quiet authority mixed with barely contained desperation. No one in the city's gossip columns knew her name. No camera flash followed her. But every staff member who saw her that day would carry the image with them for the rest of their lives. The concierge's fingers froze above the keyboard. The bellhop stopped mid-sentence. Even Mr. Eaton, the manager who prided himself on multilingual charm and had navigated diplomatic incidents with visiting dignitaries, found himself stepping forward from his usual post by the elevators, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. When she spoke, her voice was cultured, precise, but there was something else beneath it. An urgency she was working hard to conceal. She spoke rapidly in Mandarin, her words flowing like water over stone, her frustration mounting as blank stares met her increasingly desperate attempts at communication. Not until a voice rose from behind the floral cart, calm, clear, unexpected. Nin zai jiao shimo? What are you looking for? The question hung in the air like a bridge spanning two worlds. It belonged to Amaya Carter, the quiet housekeeper who never spoke unless spoken to, who had been arranging fresh orchids in the lobby's centerpiece arrangement. That single exchange, 4 simple words in a language she had guarded for years, would unravel a story of forged identities, vanished lives, and a billion-dollar empire built on someone else's name. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened next could never have been rehearsed. The woman's eyes widened the moment she heard Amaya's voice. It wasn't the polite, distant reaction of a wealthy guest to a staff member. It was sharper, rawer, the flicker of recognition, like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. She stepped closer, her designer heels clicking against the marble with new urgency. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet lobby as she approached Amaya, with the deliberate care of someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. Bouquet nung, the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. Impossible. Amaya felt her heart rate quicken. She had learned Mandarin from her mother, who had insisted it was important to maintain connections to their heritage. But after her mother's disappearance when Amaya was 12, she had rarely spoken it aloud. The words felt rusty on her tongue, like a key that hadn't been used in years. The woman reached for Amaya's wrist as though she feared she might disappear, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. Her lips moved quickly, speaking again in Mandarin, softer this time, more intimate. Amaya caught only fragments, but one phrase lodged in her mind like a splinter. You look like your mother. For a moment, time collapsed. The lobby around them seemed to fade. The concerned murmurs of staff, Mr. Eaton's continued attempts at professional intervention, the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers. Everything narrowed to this single point of contact between two women who had never met, but were somehow connected by invisible threads stretching back through decades. Then, switching to English with an accent barely detectable but present nonetheless, The woman whispered the words that would change everything. "You're my daughter." Amaya felt her breath catch, her pulse thudding in her ears like a drum. She had been cleaning these penthouses for nearly 5 years, unseen by the people who checked in and out. She had folded their silk dresses with the reverence of a museum curator, dusted their crystal vases imported from Venice and Prague, arranged their orchids flown in from Thailand and Ecuador, and never once had one of them looked at her like this. Never once had someone seen her. She could have laughed, dismissed it as some cruel joke, the kind of psychological game wealthy people sometimes played with service workers for their own amusement. Instead, she stared into the woman's face, searching for a resemblance she had never thought to find. The woman's features were more refined than her own, shaped by money and careful living, but underneath the expensive makeup and perfect styling, there was something else. A bone structure that whispered of shared genetics. A way of holding her mouth that Amaya recognized from looking in mirrors. "Wo de mingzi shi Lin Mei Shu," the woman said softly, so quietly that Amaya had to lean in to hear. "My name is Lin Mei Shu." The name meant nothing to Amaya, but the way it was spoken, with the weight of confession, of a secret finally shared, made her stomach clench with anticipation and dread. Mr. Eaton intervened with professional courtesy, his voice tight with the strain of maintaining politeness while managing what was clearly becoming a delicate situation. But the woman pressed a business card into Amaya's palm, her fingers cold but her grip firm, before walking toward the elevators with barely controlled panic disguised as measured steps. Later that afternoon, as the lobby settled into the quiet rhythm of early evening, Amaya followed procedure. She had been trained well during her 5 years at the Langston. Any unusual guest interaction was to be documented immediately, no matter how minor it might seem. She filed an incident report, describing the guest's tears, her sudden claim of family, the strange conversation in a language no one else understood. But how do you reduce something like this to checkboxes and brief descriptions? Mr. Eaton read it, raised an eyebrow, and told her to forget it with the gentle but unmistakable authority of someone who had spent 20 years managing the secrets of the wealthy. "Discretion," he said firmly. "The less you think about it, the better, for everyone involved." The warning was clear. Wealthy guests paid premium prices not just for luxury accommodations but for privacy. Whatever games they played, whatever secrets they carried, whatever family dramas followed them through the doors, none of it was supposed to leave the building. But Amaya couldn't stop thinking about it. She had seen something in the woman's eyes that felt like truth, the kind that lives in bone and blood, the kind that demands acknowledgement even when logic says to walk away. That night, in her small apartment above the staff parking garage, she unlocked a drawer she hadn't opened in years. It was the bottom drawer of the small desk her mother had bought secondhand when they moved into this building, back when Amaya was 12, and her mother was still alive, still working at the university lab, still speaking about the future, as if it held possibilities instead of only questions. Inside was the only thing her mother had left her before she disappeared, a smooth jade pendant carved with a symbol she'd never been able to identify. It had always felt oddly heavy for its size, substantial in a way that seemed disproportionate to its dimensions. The jade was a deep green, almost black in dim light, and the symbol carved into its surface was complex, intersecting lines that might have been Chinese characters, or might have been something else entirely. She traced its surface with her thumb, and the image of the woman in the lobby came back with startling clarity. Not just her face, but every detail of her appearance. The way she had held herself, the desperate intensity in her eyes, the careful control in her voice when she spoke English, as if she was translating thoughts from another language. And the pendant at her throat, the same dark jade, the same complex carving, hanging from the same style of thin gold chain. The next morning, Amaya called Elijah Crane, a childhood friend now working at the city's historical records office. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same schools, shared the same dreams of escaping to something bigger. But while Amaya had dropped out of college when her mother disappeared and the money ran out, Elijah had persevered, eventually finding work in the archives where he could disappear into databases and historical records for hours. She texted him a still image from the hotel's security feed, a clear capture of the woman's face from when she had been standing near the front desk. It wasn't technically allowed, but the security system was old and the protocols were loose. Hours later, Elijah's voice crackled through her phone with barely contained excitement. "Amaya, you're not going to believe this." He had run the photo through everything: city records, property databases, old newspaper archives, university records. At first, nothing. But then he had tried the historical database, the one that included inactive records and cold cases. He had matched the face, not to any living heiress or philanthropist, but to a woman named Mei Shu Lin, a biochemical engineer who had vanished in 1993 after filing a whistleblower complaint against a multinational energy conglomerate. Her groundbreaking research, an algae-based fuel that could have revolutionized clean energy, disappeared with her. The official record said she drowned in an accident when her car was found at the bottom of Mirror Lake. No body was ever recovered. But according to the investigative journalist who had looked into it 5 years later, the disappearance was very convenient for a lot of very powerful people. She had been about to expose research fraud and environmental cover-ups worth billions of dollars. But now here she was, standing in the Langston's lobby wearing the same pendant as Amaya. And if Elijah was right, this woman was supposed to be dead. Amaya confronted her 2 days later in the quiet corner of the hotel's tea room. It was an elegant space furnished with expensive neutrality, but the documents spread across their small table transformed the anonymous luxury into something more urgent. The woman didn't flinch when Amaya approached. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "You deserve to know the truth," as if she had been waiting 30 years for this conversation. The truth was a labyrinth. Lin Meishu wasn't just a colleague of her mother's. They were sisters. Vivian Carter, Amaya's mother, had worked alongside May at the Evergreen Research Center, developing revolutionary clean energy technology that could have changed the world decades ago. But when corporate threats escalated, when their lives were in danger from people who saw their discoveries as threats to billion-dollar industries, May had made a desperate choice that haunted her every day since. She stole not just her sister's research, but her identity itself. "I thought if they focused their anger on me, she would be safe," May explained, tears streaming down her carefully composed face. "I used her name to file the whistleblower complaint, made it look like she was pushing forward despite the threats. I thought if I disappeared, if they thought their primary target was gone, Vivian and you would be protected." She paused, gathering strength for the confession that came next. "But I filed the complaint under her name. When I staged my own death, drove my car into the lake with weights, walked out through the woods to a hidden vehicle, they assumed she was still the threat. They came for her anyway." The jade pendants, May explained, were more than family heirlooms. They had been specially designed when the sisters realized how dangerous their situation was becoming. Hidden inside each was a microchip encrypted with access codes to offshore accounts containing the royalties from their revolutionary research patents. $67 million, May whispered, her voice hollow with 3 decades of guilt. "Your mother insisted on splitting everything equally. She said, if something happened to both of us, at least you would have the resources to disappear, to start over somewhere safe." Amaya touched the pendant at her throat, suddenly understanding its odd weight. For 13 years, she had been unknowingly wearing a fortune around her neck while living in poverty and working as a housekeeper. But the truth came with danger. The same people who had helped May vanish 30 years ago were still watching, still protecting the billion-dollar secrets her research had become, and they had just seen her walk into a luxury hotel and recognize a housekeeper. "The night I escaped through the woods," May continued, her voice breaking with the weight of confession, "someone else was eliminating the threat permanently. Your mother never made it to safety." She opened a thick folder she had brought to their meeting, revealing bank statements and wire transfer records that painted a picture of corporate-sponsored murder. "I hired private investigators 15 years ago," she said. I told myself it was to find Vivian, to make amends. Really, it was to assuage my guilt. These are financial records showing payments from Synthex Industries to Blackstone Strategic, a company that specializes in making problems disappear permanently. From that moment, Amaya's quiet existence was gone forever. She was thrust into a world of private investigators and sealed court records that she had never imagined existed. She and Elijah traced the stolen research through shell companies and tax havens, following money trails that spanned 3 decades and 5 continents. They discovered that Synthex Industries had built their entire renewable energy division on her mother's stolen work, using the private contractor Blackstone Strategic to eliminate whistleblowers, environmental activists, and scientists who got too close to revolutionary breakthroughs that might threaten their market control. The deeper they dug, the darker it became. Financial records showed massive payments to Blackstone Strategic, payments that spiked dramatically in September 1993, just months after Vivian Carter's disappearance, with a bonus that coincided with a massive contract renewal. They had been rewarded for permanent silence. Her mother hadn't just disappeared. She had been murdered to protect corporate profits and environmental crimes that affected the entire planet. When Amaya finally pieced it all together, the corporate conspiracy, the environmental crimes, the decades of lies and murder, she didn't go to the press for fame or revenge. She went because her mother's voice, preserved on recordings May had kept, asked her to prevent the technology from being controlled by people who saw profit margins instead of planetary salvation. She anonymously leaked every document, every scrap of evidence to investigative journalist Sarah Chen, who had been following the Synthex story for 8 years, waiting for someone with proof to come forward. The meeting took place in a small cafe, chosen because it was public enough to discourage violence but private enough for sensitive conversation. Sarah was younger than expected, with sharp eyes and focused intensity that suggested she had been waiting for this story her entire career. "This is the biggest environmental crime story I've ever encountered," Sarah said after reviewing their evidence. "If even half of what you're telling me is true, we're looking at congressional hearings, criminal investigations, and lawsuits that will reshape the entire energy industry." The story she broke was devastating. Stolen technology and corporate murder, the 30-year cover-up that changed climate history. Her reporting was meticulous and damning, featuring interviews with Amaya and May, copies of original research notes, excerpts from Vivian's voice recordings, and financial records connecting her murder to corporate profits. Within hours, it exploded across national headlines. Environmental groups organized protests outside Synthex headquarters. Congressional representatives called for immediate investigations. The story became impossible to ignore or suppress. But by the time federal agents swarmed the Langston, May was already gone. She had vanished once again, leaving behind only encrypted financial transfers that seemed to lead nowhere. Until Amaya realized they were breadcrumbs, meant to be followed. Following the trail of financial transfers, Amaya and Elijah found themselves driving through old-growth forest to a remote property on the edge of the Olympic Peninsula. There, in a cabin surrounded by towering trees, where the sound of the ocean could be heard through the branches, they discovered May in her final days. She was dying of cancer, wrapped in a blanket on the cabin's front porch despite the warm afternoon, looking frailer than she had just weeks before. But her eyes were clear, focused, and when she saw them approaching through the trees, she smiled with what looked like relief. "I didn't want to die alone in a hospital room with the lies still between us," she said. Inside the sparse but comfortable cabin, she had assembled everything she had saved for 30 years. Photographs of Vivian, copies of research notes in her sister's handwriting, personal belongings, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal containing her mother's final work. "I kept everything," she whispered, showing them the journal with trembling hands. "This contains her last project, atmospheric carbon capture technology that could potentially reverse climate change entirely. She never stopped working, even while running for her life, even knowing they would kill her for it." The scope of what had been lost, not just her mother's life, but discoveries that could have prevented decades of environmental destruction was staggering. DNA confirmation was a formality. The woman who had stolen her mother's identity was indeed her aunt, and the journals and documents in her possession left no doubt about 30 years of guilt, deception, and the murder that had made it all possible. When May died peacefully 3 days later, Amaya felt no satisfaction, only profound sadness for all the lives twisted by corporate greed and environmental destruction, and determination to ensure her mother's work would finally see the light of day. Amaya reclaimed the research in her family's name and established the Carter Foundation for Renewable Justice. The $67 million from the jade pendant became seed money for completing her mother's revolutionary discoveries and ensuring they would never again fall into corporate hands that prioritized profit over planetary survival. Congressional hearings into Synthex Industries lasted 8 months, exposing a network of environmental crimes that reached into the highest levels of corporate and political power. The company was dissolved, its assets liquidated, to pay damages to environmental groups and the families of murdered whistleblowers. Several executives were criminally prosecuted, and Blackstone Strategic was designated a terrorist organization by federal authorities. But the real justice came from implementing her mother's discoveries. Atmospheric carbon capture systems began meaningfully reversing climate damage that had accumulated for decades. Algae-based fuels replaced fossil energy sources globally, proving that the technology suppressed 30 years ago could indeed have prevented much of the environmental crisis the world now faced. Her mother's remains were finally found and properly buried, with a headstone reading, Vivian Carter, 1962-1993. She gave her life to save the world. Her work continues. When reporters pressed her about the woman who had disappeared once again, who had stolen her mother's life but finally returned her legacy, Amaya said only, "Sometimes silence is the loudest justice." And all of it. Every court battle, every revelation, every headline, every life saved by cleaner technology began with one sentence, spoken in a language Amaya had once kept hidden, in the middle of a luxury hotel lobby. What would you have done if you were Amaya Carter? Would you have exposed the truth knowing it could destroy the last living link to your family? Or would you have stayed silent to protect what was left? Tell us in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. It's the